All right, here's another crime lecture, the sociology of crime, taken in bite sizes. This one is about stereotypes of crime, why we have stereotypes of crime. So, if you remember in our last video, we talked about the way we think of crime as a social construction, the sort of four categories of crime that the FBI gives us, and why I sort of left dangling why we don't think about white collar crime as much as we think about street crime. And so we're going to dive a little bit farther into that about the stereotype of crime. So when we talk about the stereotypes of crime, we have to, again, who are the images that come out when people think about crime? Usually it's lower class and often poor. And we had a president, I can't remember his name, he's a guy with crazy orange skin and yellow hair who talked about Mexicans are rapists and murderers. Right. And some of them, I imagine, are nice people. That's what his quote was, if I remember it right. We have a very racialized image of crime. Where does that come from? Why do we have that? So that's what we're going to dive into in this video. And to do that, we need a particular name, because this name kind of orients us towards this, what the stereotype of crime is really about. And that name is Willie Horton. Willie Horton was a man who made the news big time in 1988 in a major way. And so 1988 was much like this year, although much different than this year, was a year of a presidential election. There's going to be an election this year, right? Right? If Jared Kushner lets us have the election. So it was the end of 2 terms of Ronald Reagan, the Republican president. His vice president, George Bush Sr., was running for president, and his main opponent on the Democratic side of the aisle was Mike Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts, who in the first half of 1988 was ahead in the polls. So people thought this was going to be the end of Reagan-Bush for a couple reasons. One was the economy was in a recession. The sort of promise of Reaganomics had sort of caved in by 1988. There was a rise in the crime rate that was sort of the top story of the news that was happening on Reagan's watch. And there was a lot of scandal associated. Reagan had one of the most indicted cabinets, and there was something called the Iran-Contra scandal, in which the Reagan administration was found to be trafficking in illegal weapons to raise money for hostages. It's an Iran-Contra scandal. Google it. So basically, people were tired of Reagan. Everybody thinks everybody loved Ronald Reagan, but at the end of his 8 years, he was not that popular. Meanwhile, Mike Dukakis was the head of a very successful state. While their economy nationally was in the dumps, in 1988, Massachusetts was having what was called the Massachusetts Miracle. The Dukakis was sort of ahead of the curve on high-tech industries and bringing sort of computer, silicon chip type industries into Massachusetts. So their economy was doing well. So people were like, this Mike Dukakis might make a really good president. So he was the head. This is a little political story I'm telling you. And so it looked like Bush was going to lose, but Bush had a campaign director, a guy named Lee Atwater, who is sort of known as the father of modern dirty politics. Politics have always been dirty, and there's always been a lot of spreading rumors and on, who's sleeping with whom, the kind of stuff. And so Lee Atwater is like, we got to find some dirt on Dukakis. We got to find something on Dukakis to sink his candidacy so Bush can win in November. And they looked, and his wife had struggled with some mental health issues. That didn't fly. He was short. That didn't fly. He was an immigrant. His parents were Greek immigrants. That didn't fly. And then finally they found something. There's a program that exists in many states with Republican governors and many states with Democratic governors, called the Prison Furlough Program. When you've got someone in prison, even if they're there for life, often they can be approved for parole. You can let them out and let them in the community. They're still under supervision, but they're in parole. And so the Prison Furlough Program is a program to take inmates who have been well behaved and give them a weekend pass. Let them go out for the weekend and look, we're going to see how you do. And if you do well and you don't break any rules and you're the nicest person in the world, when you come back, that will be a factor in favor of giving you parole when it's time for your parole. Very popular in Republican and Democratic states. No program is 100% effective, and sometimes people who are given weekend furloughs do bad things. Well, there was one of these characters. The Prince record just fell. There was one of these characters that was on Weekend Pass when Mike Dukakis was the governor, named William Horton, who chose to use his weekend pass to go on a crime spree. The exact opposite of what you're supposed to do. Goes on a crime spree, goes into like a Boston couple's condo and brutally beats them, robs them, home invasion, and rapes the woman, and is caught, and surprise, surprise, doesn't get parole. It doesn't make that much of a news blip until Lee Atwater gets it, and all of a sudden they've got something, because the crime is the number one issue, the rising crime rate. This is the era of gangster rap and drive-by shootings, and everybody's freaking out about urban crime. And so Atwater's like, I think we got something, and he takes this mugshot of this guy, who, by the way, is black, and by the way, his victims were white. He rebrands him, not as William Horton, which is what everyone knew him as, but Willie Horton, which is kind of a stereotypical black name, and runs an ad that says, Dukakis is soft on crime. While governor of Massachusetts, he let this convicted felon out on the weekend, and he attacked this nice couple, and it was horrible. Don't vote for Dukakis, he's soft on crime. And the message was, you vote for this guy, and he's going to let black criminals who target white victims out onto the streets. That ad ran for one weekend in the summer of 1988, and the polls flipped. Dukakis had been ahead, they ran the Willie Horton ad, and all of a sudden Bush was ahead, and Bush went on to win the election in November, as I'm sure you know if you know your history of America. We often talk about the Willie Horton moment. Like, there is a Willie Horton moment when an election will just sort of turn on a dime. So in 2016, a lot of people thought, Trump bragging about grabbing women by the pussy. Remember that guy? That guy thought, oh, that's his Willie Horton moment. He's done. I don't know. Things have changed a little bit. But also, so there'll probably be a Willie Horton moment this year, I'm sure. And it refers to that story that happened in 1988 that literally changed the outcome of the presidential election. But why it's important for us is it's also about the power of the racial stereotype of crime. The crime is committed by, especially violent crime, is committed by black males against white people. Innocent white people who are the targets of savage black males. I mean, that's a narrative that goes way back. And so when we talk about the stereotype of crime, now, all these years later, 30-something years later, 32 years later, we talk about the Willie Horton stereotype. So when you hear that, it just doesn't mean the stereotype of black crime. It means the stereotype of black criminals with white victims, that you are at risk from violent black men in society. So where does that stereotype come from? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that. We could do a whole 10 weeks just on this topic, let me tell you. So one of the things has to be acknowledged is the role the media plays. The media is one of our socialization agents. Media is full of stereotypes. It often uses stereotypes to tell a story. That the stereotype, that I had as a kid watching TV was white cops and black criminals. I mean, I saw it every time I turned on the TV and watched my favorite cop shows like Starsky and Hutch, in which, there was a black character named Huggy Bear who was a pimp. I was brainwashed, socialized, but brainwashed really, into this notion that black equals criminal, especially black male equals criminal, because so much just like you get brainwashed with the notion that Muslim equals terrorist. I mean, how many times has the media played that one out? And over, media in movies and TV shows, and you just get it over and over. Even in Disney movies, the criminals are always darker skinned. Watch it. Watch a movie like Aladdin. They're all Arabs in Aladdin. But the bad guys are much darker than Aladdin, who's the good guy, and it looks very European, where the bad guys look, very Middle Eastern and Semitic looking. And so the media really sort of reinforces this stereotype that black equals bad, or dark equals bad, or immigrant equals bad, or now brown is the new black, y'all. That, these brown people are going to come and invade your home, and, But also when we talk about the media, we have to talk about the role the local news plays. Local news has as its motto, if it bleeds, it leads. Right? We were sort of talking about this the other day about how local news is really heavy on crime, especially violent crime, and they'll put it right at the front of the news because it gets eyeballs. Right? If you put a story about a kid with cancer at the front of the news, but you get a story about a stabbing or a shooting, right? That's going to get people in. And so local news loves crime stories, and they'll put it right at the front of the news. And cities like Portland that don't have a very high crime rate, often they have to go to other places like Tacoma and Spokane to find a crime that's happening. If there's something happening in Salem, it's going to be on the front of the Portland News because they need that crime story right up front. And the way that works for most cities, Portland is a little bit unique because of its racist history. Most urban areas have a disproportionate number of minorities. Like you have the black urban core in the city, in the ghetto, the funky, funky ghetto. Inner city blues. I'm going to do all the inner city songs. I won't sing them for you. And so if the TV station is located downtown and they need a good crime story, they just walk out of the door and they're in the inner city, and there's going to be some crimes. There's also the same crimes happening in the suburban area and the rural area that aren't getting the media attention from the local news. Why? Because it's harder to go out there in the rural areas where there's lots of stabbing and lots of drugs and lots of domestic violence and lots of murder, and the same stuff that's happened in the rural area that's happened in the urban area, but it's just too darn hard to get into the news van and drive all the way out to East Bum Hell to cover the murder that's out there when there's a murder happening right next to the TV station. So when the people in the suburbs and the rural areas turn on the local news, what they see is black crime. Black and brown crime, the stuff that's happening in the city. The exact same thing is happening in the rural area and the suburban areas, but it's not on the news with all this sort of drama associated with it. So the local news has gone a long way to reinforcing these stereotypes. And then there are sort of like true cop shows. I don't know if anybody's ever watched Cops. Bad boys, bad boys. What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? It's, really focused on street crime. If it's not, in the ghetto, they're in a poor white area in a trailer park focusing on the crimes of those poor people. And very rarely, in fact, never do you see them in bourgeois upper class neighborhoods, right? Or there's just as much drugs being done in Westland, Oregon as there is in, the poorest part of Salem, Oregon. But you don't see that. It's all sort of off the grid. And so those shows like Cops really do. And of course they never cover white collar crime, which ultimately, as we discussed last time, has a bigger impact on your life. Somebody steals $20 from you, that sucks. Somebody steals $2,000 from you in your annual insurance premium payments or taxes. That's a bigger deal, but you don't see it on the 6 o'clock news. So the media is part of that. Also, another part of that has to do with the FBI. We've talked about the FBI giving us these 4 typologies, remember? Violent crime, property crime, victimless crimes, and white-collar crimes. First of all, when they show those crimes, when they tell us about the crimes that are happening, there's no mention of white-collar crime. When we do look at the crime index, how is crime doing in America? It's just purely property crimes and violent crimes. There's barely a mention of drug crimes and zero mention of white-collar crime. So when they talk about crime, and I have I do a lot of work with the FBI, and I asked one time, I said, hey, FBI person, FBI agent, the FBI index includes 8 crimes to describe the situation of crime in America, and there are no white-collar crimes in it. Now, coming from a conflict perspective, my analysis of that would be that reinforces the stereotype of who the criminals are. The criminals are the people that are stealing cars, not the people that are embezzling from banks. The criminals are the people that are getting in, fist fights in front of bars, not the people that are dumping toxic waste where they shouldn't dump it. So it reinforces in the FBI who doesn't want the sort of rich white people who are engaged in some of these really serious crimes to be seen as the criminals. They want to reinforce the status quo, right? Maintain the status quo. So they create this index that says crime is by poor people, especially poor minority people. and it reinforces the status quo because it's easy to go lock those people up. But the FBI agent didn't say that. He wasn't a conflict theorist. He was more of a functionalist. And what he said is, these are the crimes Americans care the most about. They don't care about price fixing. They don't care about insider trading. They don't care about stock price manipulation. They care about rape and murder and having their car stolen. So there's reflecting a consensus of what the organism cares the most about. Which is true? I don't know. You decide. So, the FBI uses a mechanism to measure crime in America, and it's called the Uniform Crime Report. The FBI UCR stands Uniform Crime Report. I'll include a link on this video. And that UCR, the Uniform Crime Report, is based on crimes that are reported to the police every year. They're reported to local police departments, Hillsborough Police. They're reported to county sheriffs, Washington County sheriffs. They're reported to state police, Oregon State Police. They're reported to national police, like the FBI. And so it's based on reports and arrests, the people who are arrested for those crimes. And when I'm going to have to make a little diagram here. When we look at those crimes, it's a pretty useful measure. I mean, we've been doing the Uniform Crime Report since the 1930s, since the days of J. Edgar Hoover. It allows us to do some interesting things over time. Like, you might not know this, but since 1994, the crime rate in America has been dropping fairly steadily. Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, they all take credit for it. But this crime rate has been dropping. And part of that is because it went up so bad in the 80s and early 90s that it's been dropping about 5%. It's kind of leveled off now. And I expect it's probably going to go up if Trump sticks around much longer. That it also allows us to look at patterns. So where you're most likely to see crime rates elevated. So, for example, one of the things we learned from this data is most crimes happen in or around the home. So more on that. The home is not always the best place to be. We learned that cities have bigger crime rates than the country does, but cities over 500,000, actually the crime rate starts to go down. So it allows us to do some cool stuff with what we call data, and you know how much sociologists love data. So the UCR is very useful, but when we use it, we need to put a big old asterisk, UCR asterisk, because it is only crimes that are reported to the police. And you know that a lot of crimes aren't reported to the police. I mean, if you had your backpack stolen, would you call the cops? Right? We had somebody break into our car, and the only thing that they stole was the hand sanitizer. This is the COVID world we live in. Did I call the cops? Nah, it's all right. It's okay. I can get some more hand sanitizer. I mean, most crimes are not reported. Think about crimes like rape, for example. I mean, talk about a very violent, invasive crime. Most rapes are not reported for reasons that you can guess. And so what we end up with when we look at the UCR is something that's the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg. The notion of the iceberg, a little part of the iceberg sticks out of the water, and then the Titanic crashes into it because most of the iceberg is below. You're not going to make me sing the Titanic song. I'll do it. You're far. No, that's not allowed. So when we look at the UCR, there's also this huge part under the water that's unreported that we call the DFC, the dark figure of crime. DFC, dark figure of crime. And when we look at that type of crime, this is what sociologists do when they start doing crime surveys. The DFC, the types of crimes that are a majority of crimes, especially things like rape and hate crimes and, things that just do not get reported, are much different. What do I mean? The UCR data, the official data that we get, reinforces the Willie Horton stereotype. We see crime is higher in urban areas. We see crime is higher among poor people. We see crime is more likely to be stranger and interracial, like white on black and black on white. But when we look at the majority, and this is really important, when we look at the majority that's under the water, the dark figure of crime, we find that most crimes are committed by people who know each other. People who know each other. You're more likely to be victimized by somebody you know than somebody you don't know. So this whole thing about don't talk to strangers, I mean, only talk to strangers. The people that you know are the ones that will murder you. One of the things that we get from the data is that homes are like something like 42 times more dangerous than public transportation. Buses, you're safe on a bus. You are safe on the bus. So this is my advice to you: is if you're taking a bus, you're safe on the bus, and just if you're heading home on the bus, when you get home, don't get off the bus because you're going to get murdered at home. So stay on the bus until you start to feel like you know the people on the bus, and you've been on the bus so long that you're friends. Then get off that bus and get on another bus. You do that, and I promise you will never be murdered. Go home. It's 50-50. But anyway, when we look at the dark figure of crime, I'm only sort of being half serious. When we look at the dark figure of crime, crimes tend to be committed by people who know each other. One of the things that we learned is only 22% of rapes, for example, are committed by strangers. That means 78% are committed by people who are known to the victim, including family members and boyfriends and ex-boyfriends and neighbors and uncles and friends, and all that. So those crimes, because they're committed by people who know each other, are more likely to be intra-racial, meaning white on white. So the crimes are qualitatively different, but they destroy the Willie Horton stereotype. And first of all, you find out that people up and down the class ladder are all doing crime. Rich kids are stealing cars too. But the official data from the UCR reinforces the stereotype. It reinforces that. And so here's interesting scenario, the way to think about it. You're out on a Saturday night. Oh my gosh. I'm so nostalgic for early 2020. Remember early 2020 when we'd go out on a Saturday night? Those were the day. You're out on a Saturday night. Let's say you're in the club district in Old Town Chinatown, and you're with some friends, and you're coming out of a bar, and people have been drinking, and your friends, and you get into an argument. Your friend punches you in the face. Are you going to call the cops? Probably not. It's your friend. And yeah, they assaulted you, but you'll deal with it later, and you know them, you know the backstory, you probably deserve to get punched in the face or whatever. Let's say the second scenario is you come out of the same place, the Dixie Tavern, and some person you don't know comes out of the blue and just punches you. Ouch. I just punched myself in the face. I did that for you. Punches you in the face. It's just coffee, I swear to God. And runs off. You're probably more likely to get out your phone and call the cops and say, "Hi, I've been assaulted," right? I mean, it's just more likely since it's a stranger. And that's the stuff that the police respond to, and that's the data that ends up in the UCR. So the UCR data goes to reinforce the stereotype. I've had Klansmen, members of the Ku Klux Klan, say, you don't think black people are more violent? Look at the FBI UCR and look at that data. Black people are 12% of the population, 45% of the arrests for violent crime. And it proves their point. And I have to be like, well, what about all the crimes that don't get reported to the cops and nobody gets arrested? When your crazy white uncle hits you over the head with a board and you don't call the cops. That's not in there. White people. So also we have an institutional, and this is important because we're later going to get into a discussion about institutional racism. We have a system that institutionalizes those systems that reinforce the stereotypes. And then the third thing, so the first thing is the media, the second thing is the Uniform Crime Report, and the third thing is the stereotype just reinforces notions of white supremacy. It reinforces the notion that white people are better and more civilized and minority people are somehow uncivilized, and that goes way back to the slave trade, and we're certainly going to get into that. But it just sort of reinforces, because we'll talk more about stereotypes, but what happens, when, you have a black or a brown person goes on a shooting spree, it's because they were black or brown. When a white person goes on a shooting spree, they're crazy. Something wrong. Maybe the little screw is loose. It's not about the color of their skin. I got into a big argument on a national news program because I talked about Christian terrorists, people that are espouse white supremacists who follow Christian identity ideology, which is a racist Christian belief system, And the person on the news is like, well, all Christians aren't terrorists. Well, I'm like, well, then stop saying Muslim terrorists, because all Muslims are not terrorists. But you say Muslim terrorists because it's so easy, because it reinforces the racial hierarchy about WASP people are normal and good and everybody else is somehow defective. So the third part of that, which is something we're going to get a lot more into when we talk about racism, is it reinforces the racist narratives that stay with us in the 2020s. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of hit those points to talk about why we have the Willie Horton stereotype, right? Media, FBI, UCR, and it reinforces the already existing. You know, the people that think that the white people that think that slavery ended racism. You know, racism ended in 1865 when the Civil War ended, and that's it. It's been all good in the hood since. Or because we had a black president, there's no more racism. Those are just sort of white people who need a little bit of help understanding the depth of this problem, that it is systemic. Okay, so that's it. I just wanted to do that little bit, and then we're going to talk about talk about drugs again, and we're also going to talk about theories of crime in the third and final crime video. Okay. Ow. See ya.